Friends have a long-standing concern with justice issues and prison issues that stem back to our earliest history. I think that I wouldn't be untruthful to say that that concern has carried through all of our 350-year history and is still very alive today. That being said, in the last several years, Friends, through much of our work ecumenically, have had the opportunity to grow and learn and challenge what we know to be true about responses to crime, thinking specifically about what's really needed in the aftermath of crime and how we can speak this truth about what's needed into the wider community. In the last several years, this has become more important because of the large amount of punitive legislation, increasingly punitive legislation that's been introduced in Canada under the, quote, tough on crime legislative agenda of the current government. Probably the most important learning that I've received in the last several years has come about from speaking with and spending time with and learning from and focusing on people who've been harmed by crime in Canada. And the chief learning that I've taken away is how offender-focused we are in our concern, in our response, in our resource, and in our perspective. So as a response to this, I was asked by a friend who's a Mennonite to examine some of what we know to be true about law enforcement. And so we've put together some resources that we would like to share. These are in draft form currently. And what I did was I spent a day delving into statistics and what I know I can actually point to as information coming from reliable sources to speak truth into this concern for crime and justice in Canada. So the first thing I know to be true is that there are about 40,000 laws on the books in Canada. Those are provincial and federal statutes and laws. They don't include municipal bylaws. The Canadian Police Services in 2007 reported about 2.3 million criminal code incidences. So those are cases of criminal code offenses where people have called 911 and the police have responded and said, yes, I think something has happened here that is probably a criminal code offense. When you speak to professionals who work in law enforcement and the legal field, they estimate that about 10% of crime is reported. Periodically, Stats Canada runs what they call a general social survey about every 10 years. And one of the questions that they ask is, for violent offenses, have you experienced any and did you report it to police? So for violent criminal code offenses, based on that survey, we know that 34% of people report violent offenses. So if we extrapolate that beyond violent offenses to that 2.3 million offenses in Canada, we know that there's a minimum of 6.7 million offenses that happen in Canada every year. That's a lot of harm, and that's a lot of crime. And when we even think about and use the language of crime to talk about this harm, I think for practical and also emotional reasons, we go into a very practical place in our head that thinks about numbers and thinks about safety, maybe. But sometimes we forget to think about the 6.7 million victims that are at the end of a lot of that crime. If we look at 2005-2006, we know that the courts in Canada processed a total of 373,000 cases. From those 373,000 cases, 244,000 cases led up to and ended in a conviction, some kind of a conviction that ended in a sentence of some sort. Of the 6.76 million incidences of crime, we're able to convict 244,000 cases, or about 3.6% of offenses. Of those 244,000, about 82,000 convictions ended in some kind of a custodial sentence in a prison. So of all of the criminal incidences in Canada, only 1.2% end up in prison. Well, what does that tell me? Justice is not inexpensive in Canada. The last year for which the federal government reported the costs of law enforcement, the courts, and corrections in a way that's easily accessible was 2003. And I can tell you that it's gotten much more expensive since then. But in 2003, we know that $12.65 billion were spent on law enforcement to convict about 4% of the crime in Canada. But largely, when you think of the harm that's happening in Canada, unfortunately, it's somewhat irrelevant because it's only dealing with 4% of the crime. So 96% of the harm that happens in Canada, the criminal harm, is never addressed by law enforcement and the legal system. There's a lot of space to do a lot of good that doesn't have to necessarily restrict itself to the legal system, law enforcement, and corrections. So I want people to be aware that while we spend vast sums of our resources, and I can tell you that is increasing dramatically with the legislation that's been introduced and has been, some of which has in fact come into being, and some of which is in front of the House of Commons and the Senate currently, it still will not address some of the most grievous need, I believe, which is the need of victims. So some of what we have tried to do at Quakers Fostering Justice is to create some resources to help people understand why some of what this current government is trying to dismantle is counterproductive. And some of what we've learned that does work is to speak directly into those things that this government says they're about, which is tough on crime and community safety.